Hi everyone, welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan, and today we have Jon Peterson on to talk about the 50th anniversary of D&D and his massive new book, The Making of Original Dungeons & Dragons, 1970 to 1977. Hey, Jon.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
All that and more today on Wandering DMs.
Before we get started with Jon, I just want to remind everyone that, as always, at the end of the show, we'll be hosting our after-party chat. That is a live video chat hosted by Dan and I on our Discord server. And you can join in on that by being a patron. Join patreon.com/wanderingdms. Join at any tier, and you'll get an invite to our Discord server. And maybe about 10 after 2 Eastern Time, we will start up that video chat, and we hope to see you there.
Am I invited
that every week? We would love that.
Yeah.
That would be crazy.
Absolutely invited, Jon. Absolutely.
I need to find Discord on this thing. I'm sure it's there somewhere, but yeah.
We're going to get Jon on Discord.
That's fantastic.
Definitely.
Fantastic.
So, Jon, it's a summer of 2024, and some of us are reflecting back on the 50th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons' first publication. So I assume that you're taking it easy this year, you're kicking back. It looks like you're in a comfortable place, and you just have lots of extra time this summer. Is that right?
I mean, I deserved a break from my perspective. I put in a lot of work on this stuff over the last, 12 years, and I thought I could just kind of let this one coast.
Now, to be clear, viewers, this is entirely a bit. So Jon, Jon has 3 or 4 books out this year and more on the way, and I am personally completely boggled at how he's had energy for this I'm calling it his Annus Mirabilis is what I'm calling it now. So let's talk about one. So just a couple of weeks ago, right? What was released was The Making of Original D&D 1970 to 77. And it's officially published by Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. It's getting rave reviews. I saw a review at MSN that calls it a must-have for D&D historians. The earliest era documented like never before. Says it's massive, and at 600 pages, he points out that it's noticeably thicker than the art and Arcana book that you previously worked on, noticeably thicker. So somewhat larger than this prior text that Jon worked on.
Well, I mean, to be fair, that is the slipcase. There's a more slender book inside that, of which this one is noticeably larger.
Not very much, though. It's really heavy. So tell us a little bit. So what? And you've been working on this for a couple of years, I understand. Is this the ultimate book about the making of D&D?
It's a good question. Yeah. So I have been working on it for a few years. I mean, it was back in May of 2021 that Wizards reached out to me. At the time, Ray Winninger, who was he was executive producer for D&D then, was like, well, 50th anniversary is coming up. We should do something. You're my first call. What should we do? And, from there, this kind of started going through all these permutations. And I mean, honestly, we imagine things that could be at $1,000 price point that would be like really comprehensive, covering the entire history of the brand and things like that. And we went through a bunch of different iterations of this, but it was clear to me from the start, and this was my initial reaction to Ray at the time, that we had to get some of these early documents, especially things that people might not have been able to see before. Some of these correspondences, drafts, things like that, just development text. I mean, some of my favorite things in the book are actually just like, the individual sheet of paper that shows the cleanup crew, hand drawn, that, shows the gray ooze and the purple, like all ochre jelly, all the things like kind of on one grid that you can see. It's all the little things like that I think are really cool about this, that kind of show conceptually how D&D came together. So for me, that always had to be in whatever version of the product we were going to eventually arrive at. Like, that was the condition for my involvement, was that we were going to do this. And, we eventually got to a place where it was relatively nailed down. I mean, like any book project like this, a lot of things inevitably happen at the last minute, and there were last minute changes and things like that. But, I think what we ended up with, is a definitive source book. Now, it can't be exhaustive, and I try to be clear about that in my own intro to the book, to say that, if I had my druthers, of course, there would have been twice as much material in this, and the book would have been, 1,200 pages instead of 600 pages. We scaled it back quite a bit from that, but it also can't be exhaustive in the sense that the history of D&D is still, to me, a fairly young, discipline. This is something where, I think there could still be tremendous archival resources that could come to light that we're not even aware of yet. And, I think it's a good snapshot of stuff that is definitely canonical and significant to this. And I hope it will be a good tool for people that want to explore this history further. But it's not trying to be a narrative. I mean, I wrote a little bit of text that just contextualizes the individual objects. It's not much, not by Jon Peterson standards of writing things. It's certainly not much. You could think about it to me, and since I was doing the revision to Playing at the World simultaneously with this process, to me, it was kind of this would be a source book that would be really handy to have as you're going through Playing at the World's narrative, and vice versa, right? They're intended to kind of complement one another.
Nice. I notice we have some interesting comments in our from our viewers happening right now. Mark Clover is in the comments, and he's saying, as a manager at Lake Geneva Games, I donated a copy of to the Wizard of Lake Geneva. Gary Gygax would exhibit at the Geneva Lake Museum, which they allow folks to look through as part of their tour. So, Mark, thanks so much for pointing out. That's awesome. Yeah, these kinds of the places where the documents come from, and the generosity of people like Mark to make these things available, I think, is really key to this kind of scholarship work. What new people did, where did the most interesting documents come from for this work, John?
I mean, I give kind of the same answer to that every time people ask me how documents for this are sourced, right? In some cases, these are things that I acquired before Playing at the World, original 2012 Playing at the World had come out, right? And, I did my best to find those kinds of fanzine resources back then. And so, for example, we're able to reprint in here the Europa zines, which are post D&D, right? But, give, I think, probably the only a good introduction anybody gave for D&D, because they certainly weren't in the 3 little brown booklets, a statement of how you play the game or what you're supposed to do. Yeah. Being able to do those and to have archival grade copies of those scanned and put into a book like this, of course, that's super significant. But that is stuff that, again, I had even back then. Obviously, since Playing at the World came out, it was kind of my privilege to meet a lot of people who were proximate to this history, and in some cases to be able to purchase occasionally quite substantial collections of material from these people. So, I mean, some of it came from things like that. I don't really get into the nitty gritty. I mean, there's some that are obvious. I think the Bernard fragments, it's pretty obvious who I got those from. I got them from Mike Bernard. Right? I haven't really made much of a secret of that. But other than that, I don't really get into this came from this person, this came from that person. Really, I think the community has been very supportive, I would say, overall of my efforts to try to accumulate the necessary material to get to a deeper level of understanding than I had when I did original Playing at the World. And I wasn't sure that would be true, when I was writing it or when it came out, that people would like it or anyone would care. And, it really has been a privilege for me to be able to meet a lot of these people and then to be able to work with this material.
I don't know if I've ever gotten a chance to tell you, but whenever we have, pretty much inevitably, when we have old school D&D participants on the show as guests, there's a point at some point they almost always go, there's this guy named Jon Peterson who does really interesting D&D historical work, and we have to go, yes, everybody tells us. We know, we've chatted with him, everybody says this. And John, I think you're very much at the nexus of it seems like everybody's first thought of a person to go to for historical D&D questions is your not just at what comes to mind at Wizards, but basically everybody thinks of you first for this kind of spectacular work that you've been doing.
Well, I mean, that's very generous. I mean, I think there's room for a lot of voices in this discussion, and I think especially as I have felt kind of more established in this, I feel it's ever more important to say it's not just me, right? There's a lot of people doing cool stuff around this, and the 50th anniversary certainly doesn't belong to me or anything like that. And I hope that everybody in the community has a chance to listen to anybody who's got something cool to say about this, because there's a ton of different perspectives, and there's certainly room for it.
Nice. One thing that slightly surprises me, about this work here, the making of original D&D, being published by Wizards, is I'm almost surprised that they devoted a book just to original D&D. I would have thought, market-wise, that they would have pushed for a reflection on D&D across the years, culminating with the current version. Was it a challenge for you to get this particular work made, or was there pushback about the focus on the D&D in the 70s?
No, not at all, really. Like I said, since this went through a number of different kind of iterations of what it could have been, I think there were versions of this that were considered that were more expansive. And, you never know. If people like this and it does well, I could certainly see similar projects that, I might or might not be involved with going forward, that would explore different eras. I think the 3E era, especially the run up to 3E, right after Wizards acquired TSR up to when 3rd edition came out, is probably, if I had to pick one other era I think warrants this kind of treatment, it's that. Because that really was a second bite at the apple in a way that AD&D and even 2E, I think, weren't. This was a time when you could really propose fundamentally restructuring things about the system that would have been off limits even for 2nd edition. So, I mean, sure, I don't think that they were uncomfortable approaching this era as the focus for this. And like I said, I'm hopeful if people like this and, if it sells well, then I imagine there could be other projects similar to it for other editions of D&D.
I think that's the 3rd edition thought is very interesting, and that's a case. Paul and I played 3rd edition style D&D pretty deeply for quite a while, and it's an interesting case that the main movers of that are still available to us. We've had Sean Reynolds on the show, we've had Peter Adkison on the show. Just this morning, I think on Twitter, Jonathan, I'm forgetting his last name.
Tweet?
Was defending specific decisions in 3rd edition. So it's a subject that is still, still argued about, still defended literally this morning, today. So I agree, that does seem like a rich vein if you get an opportunity to dig into that. That would be nice.
And I'm sure Jonathan's attention has, reverted to this in part because of this series that we've been doing for Gen Con TV in the lead up to Gen Con this summer, where in this, Peter has been running Gen Con TV as kind of one of his passion projects for the past couple of years. And, he lighted on this idea that we could play each edition of D&D. And unfortunately, Zeroth kind of has to stand in for Basic and VX and BECME, right? We kind of, up to Rules Cyclopedia, we sort of conflate that all into the Zero bucket, even though we strictly play 1974 D&D. But being able to do original D&D, then 1st Ed, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, with different people running them. In the cases where we could get them, the people that actually were principal designers. And so Jonathan actually ran the 3rd edition version of this. And miraculously, we actually got to do these. And we did them like live on Twitch, although they're all up on YouTube now, like sequentially. Like I went to Seattle and we did Zeroth, and then Luke Gygax ran first, and Zeb Cook ran second, Jonathan ran fourth, Rob Heinzu Jonathan ran third, Rob Heinzu ran fourth, and then Mike Merles ran fifth. Like, so
Wow.
being able to do that, I think, is another great testament to this. But before we actually did the actual play part of each of these sessions, we spent like an hour or two just talking about the history and circumstances of the game coming together. And so Jonathan had to, and he was there with Monty Cook, and, you know, like kind of they got to talk about their roles in this and kind of how 3E came together. And we're actually going to be running panels like this at Gen Con this year as well. I'm doing 8 panels at Gen Con this year. You can, you know, please convince me to not take on so much in the future if you have the opportunity. But you know, we do 8 panels about the history of D&D there, and basically rerunning the introductory discussions, though, you know, live, and so there could be a bit more dynamism and audience participation or whatever around it.
So out of curiosity, when you were running these different games, I'm sure you didn't do this, but I have to ask because it's the kind of nerdy content I would want to see. Did you sit down and translate the characters from one edition to the next and the next? Or did you just make all
so the games were all different and were kind of chosen individually by people. And so, you know, when I was doing the you know, original D&D version, you know, I did have to kind of sit down and say, well, do I dare to run like Greyhawk or Blackmore or something? And I eventually landed on the notion that it would be more representative of the OD&D experience to kind of envision a character, right? I was basically like playing a character. And in fact, in my mind, it was quite a narrow one. I was like, so I'm a guy named Dale who lives in Michigan, who's part of like the wargaming circles there in Michigan, who had played the game with Gary, so he knew what it was, but really he was trying to do like a pretty literal interpretation of what he saw in the 74 books, and it had like more of a wargaming slant. And so, you know, I mean, the adventure I made was pure homebrew, and the characters I used were rolled 3d6 in order, and like were only the character types that were available in OD&D. And so it was pretty, I would not wish that as continuing characters on anyone going forward for
it's just it's such an interesting little piece of the history of the game. I think that you know, Dan mentioned that he and I spent a lot of time playing 3rd edition together, but that game actually started as a 2nd edition game, and we went through that process, as I recall. And I think maybe Wizards published a guide on how to do it. They definitely did that for 2nd edition, which I have stashed.
Conversion manual was the guide for 3rd edition.
Yeah. Which is just such an interesting.
You get them for free, and obviously then, So I was in a 2nd ed campaign. I wasn't running it, but I've been playing in a whole series of kind of connected 2nd ed campaigns in the 90s. And when 3rd edition came out, that's what I ran. I ran a lot of 3rd edition in the early 2000s, kind of in the lead up, actually, to starting to work on Playing the World. You can think about it like that's where my head was deep in that. I even played a bit of 4th when 4th came out, though that didn't really stick for my crowd.
It feels like so many of us used the end of 3rd edition as an opportunity to transition to thinking about original D&D. And I had never accessed original D&D books until 2007 or something like that. I'd never played original D&D. I'd heard about it. And then once I actually got my hands on the original thing, that's actually what I've, you know, to some household extent, what I've played ever since. Do you have, like, why was it 3rd edition that aimed so many of us back at original D&D?
That's a good question. I mean, I got original D&D. I got my first brown box in 1998, so a little before 3rd edition came out. But it's true, it's not like I played it. You know, it's not like I bought it. I bought it effectively as a collectible, right? Like I've been buying a lot of Magic cards in the 90s, and so I'd gotten a bit of the collector vibe just from being in early Magic. And, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously a lot of people feel like by the time 4th edition came out, you know, the brand had lost its way a bit. And, you know, if you read the way Rob Heinzu talks about it in the, you know, in that Gen Con series we're referring to, I mean, more so than I would have thought, he was like, this was basically a cynical cash grab, like to get people like into the player's handbook and stuff. Which, if that's a perception, he's willing to go on record saying, I'm not surprised then that people did kind of turn their attention elsewhere, whether that was to Pathfinder or all the way back to the original. But you think also the passing of Gary and Dave, right? Like, which was right around that time, 2008, 2009. I think that got a lot of people thinking about the origins of the hobby. And it did also, in the lead up to the game's 30th anniversary, kind of in the mid 2000s, that was a time when people like Gary and Dave were giving a lot of interviews, talking a lot about the original hobby. It's the high era of Gygax holding court on EN World and, answering 75 fan questions a day, right? And so I think there were a number of factors that kind of converged then to get people really asking questions about, well, what was it D&D accomplished, and why did it set off this cultural phenomenon that it did?
John, let me ask a little bit about your personal history with it, because this was a question that showed up in our chat a little while ago, and Dan, if you have it handy, maybe you can pop it up on screen. What got you into this role of diving both into the original edition and then deciding to write academic works about it? What was the impetus for that?
Yeah, I think when I turned 35, I was asking myself hard questions about whether I was spending my time right. And, I wanted to try to find something to do that I didn't think anybody else would do. That would just be a weird, thing for me to investigate. The story I often tell, and as far as I know, it's not apocryphal, is that, it was after World of Warcraft came out, and I got deep into World of Warcraft. But in those first few months, from November 2004, up to February of 2015. February of 2015, some friends of mine and I all went to the British Museum. I'd been in London because we were going to an indie rock festival that was taking place down in Southampton, I believe. And while we were there, we were in the British Museum, and I saw one of those display cases, a first century AD Roman 20-sided die in the British Museum, and I just had this kind of moment where I asked kind of how far back everything went. And in particular, the question that kind of seized me was so we don't know what that die was for, these Roman dice. And it's disputed. Some people think they were for gambling, some for divination, whatever. Somebody in intellectual history must have been the first person to roll an implement of chance against a table of probability to determine whether or not a fictional event occurred. Mm-hmm. And that, for that to happen, certain prerequisites had to be met. People needed to have sufficient understanding of statistics and probability, for example. But there was a difference between, actuarial level or state level statistics. Of course, our term statistics has state in it for a reason. These were things tabulated, right, for often political or governmental reasons. Once those conditions had been met, though, who decided that you could decide fictional events by rolling dice? And in particular, that some kind of model of reality can inform the resolution of chance. It's not just flipping a coin, but there had to be, this much chance for something to happen. And I was like, so what would that have been? What would that even look like? And so I bought some books about the history of probability and read those and didn't find anything particularly enlightening. But ultimately, when you start pulling on that thread, you end up in wargaming pretty quick. And, the information that was available at the time on the history of wargaming, was not really engaging with the primary sources. It was much more engaging with long after the fact secondary sources and summaries. And so I was like, well, this seems achievable. I should be able to just go find these books. I can go to libraries. I'm in Europe a lot. I can go to European libraries where these German texts reside and go try to find where this idea came from. And really, Playing Out of the World started from that.
I'm a little bit pissed that Paul has won the best question competition today. That was a great. that was. I'm so glad you asked that. What an amazing observation. That was great, John. Wow.
Well, I mean, it's that book's been out for 12 years now. I mean, if you read it, like that's what it talks about, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I love the moment in the museum of crystallizing that was a thing that could be done. That's spectacular.
I know, Dan. I mean, you've probably done this in your role in education of mathematics, right? Of that like, I know that like a lot of the stuff I've read about the origins of probability, most of the writings begin with gambling, right? Like it seems like the thing that they were really trying to figure out. But yeah, I don't think I would have ever made the jump to like. Sorry.
Pascal and Fermat were very concerned about fair wagers and things like that in their correspondence. So.
Yeah, I can only imagine what the gambling den conversations were like at that time. Yeah, never thought to expand it to like, well, when did they start talking about fictional events? That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, and to me, the argument I make is that is the origin of the concept of simulation. And, the later things that in the 20th century we would call simulation, or looking at things like Monte Carlo, or, all the methods that were derived in, that school of thought. I mean, it all has to come back to some point, right? It seemed to me like there was a bunch of no later than dates that had to have been invented, and, not before then dates where the prerequisites didn't exist. And so what was there? And, in New Playing at the World, there are a bunch of new sources I can cite about that, because largely other people than me have now been writing about this. And so Philipp von Hilgers, like his book, found a source I hadn't found, which was like Leibniz speculating about this in the 17th century, right? That like, surely there can be ways that we can take, the principles of games and wrap around. So, it's really cool to be able to go back to it and give it a new coat of paint. Obviously, I've got a lot more sources that are more directly salient to the history of D&D that I could explore in this, and stuff that I just missed when I did Playing at the World that were inexcusable in retrospect. Like, I missed that whole Leonard Patt thing, right? That the rules for Middle Earth that Leonard Patt published the year before Chainmail came out, that Gygax obviously stole, populate and expanded on, of course, embellished and took in different directions, but that were the clear germ of that material. And yeah, it certainly makes me feel better to be able to go back to Playing at the World and put that stuff in the places where it needs to go.
I recently had the opportunity to read Peter Perla's seminal The Art of Wargaming, and I've brought it up probably about every Sunday for the past couple of months. And I read it, I completed it, and then I just immediately went back to start and just started rereading it immediately. And he quotes Jim Dunnigan from SSI as having two principles to game design. Number one, keep it simple. Number two, plagiarize. So perhaps tasteful inspiration, like Gary did from the Middle Earth game, is many designers will agree is important building block for games like the ones that we enjoy.
Well, and Wargaming was more of a Creative Commons, right, at the time. I mean, people did not meet these rules with the kind of intellectual property that we think today they warrant, right? It really was very much, I'll publish an idea in a fanzine, and if somebody picks it up and does something with it, the idea that anybody would commercialize this was the part that was so audacious. And, the audacity of Gaiden Games bringing out the Chainmail booklet, which is indeed basically an edited anthology of a bunch of rules that were drawn from different sources that have, as has been pointed out, very little connective tissue between them, right? There's kind of mass combat rules that are separate from man-to-man rules, that are separate from the jousting rules, that are separate from the fantasy rules, and not a lot to help you figure out how to turn that into a coherent experience. But then again, the rules advertise themselves as just guidelines around which you could build a game of your liking, much like a game that came out 3 years later that was called
John, if I could tie this back to your own personal history, I have a follow-up question here. Was there a moment somewhere that you remember, somewhere between that trip to the British Museum and seeing that D20 and say, I don't know, today, where you realized this might be changing the trajectory of my career?
Of my career? This is just a hobby to me.
This is just a hobby. It's still just a hobby. Yeah. Really?
Yeah. This isn't a career. So just anybody here who thinks that they would like to start writing about the history of D&D, let me be clear, it is not a remunerative career for you to choose.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I think if I break even on some sense in the projects I do, I'm happy, but it is certainly not a profit center in the work that I do in the world.
Okay.
Important information. That's important. That's important information for our viewers. That's good. That's good to be upfront about.
I mean, I shouldn't be that cut and dry about it. I mean, obviously, if you happen to work on a D&D cookbook as the result of your work on the history of D&D, you get drawn into a project like that, and it ends up on the New York Times bestseller list. You could make some money off of something like that. But, writing for a nonprofit academic press like MIT Press to do the actual crunchy history work I do, I mean, this is not a career choice.
Okay.
And now, to be clear, John's being a little bit coy about the fact that he was a principal on Heroes Feast by Wizards of the Coast a little while ago. And I guess there's a follow-up coming out this fall. Can you talk about that, or was that only off the record?
No, I'm not talking about that. So, I mean, we did Heroes Feast, and, I had no idea if anybody would like it or not, but apparently a lot of people liked it. And so we did a sequel that is called Heroes Feast Flavors of the Multiverse. And as you may be aware, we actually did a television show that I'm actually in, like, as a guest, that we filmed, like, a whole bunch of episodes of it. When I don't even know when that was now. I think it was last year we filmed them in LA, and they came out this year. I think that probably is right. But when you do a book and they make a TV show from it, and the way this TV show works, there's like a chef and for two chefs, and then they have guests and they make the recipes from the Heroes Feast books. And so the episode that myself and my co-authors Mike Whitwer and Kyle Newman were on, we made like the tavern stew, which is probably the easiest thing that you could possibly make in this. And I cut vegetables on camera, and then we ate the stew, and it was very tasty. But right, so this year, I guess we're coming out with something called the Deck of Many Morsels. So these days, instead of cookbooks, a lot of people sell these packages of recipe cards that are like big laminated cards that just kind of have a picture of the dish and then the recipes on the back, that are considered more kitchen friendly, I guess, than like having a book open. And so there are some new recipes in it. That comes out this fall sometime, I think like October. So yeah, it is the thing. But how did that happen? So that happened because we did Art and Arcana, right? And the Art and Arcana project is a project I still really love, being able to do a visual history book in a book that's really focused on the artists and their contribution to D&D. And I'm thrilled that, as some people may have heard, although there hasn't been big press about it yet, just kind of a teaser has come out, there will be more press coming. At one of the big gaming conventions in Europe, probably the largest of the gaming conventions in the West, actually. It's larger than like San Diego Comic-Con or New York Comic-Con. This convention called Lucca takes place in Italy at the end of October into the beginning of November. We're going to be able to exhibit some of these original works of D&D art, that some of which we featured in Art and Arcana, some that we didn't, that are from the collection of Matthew Coder, who is by far the largest single collector of D&D art. And Matthew, was really instrumental to us in doing Art and Arcana. Like, so many of the cool things we were able to show in that book for the original art came from his collections, and he really kind of bent over backwards for us to get us the material we needed for that. And so I've been really thrilled to be able to work with him a bit subsequently. The follow-up we did to Art and Arcana, Lore and Legends, it's kind of like a making a 5e book, I guess, if you haven't seen it. It came out last year, or I don't even know anymore when any of these. There's so many of them. I really don't when they came out because it's so decoupled from when I work on them that it's hard for me to keep it straight. But we also relied on some of his stuff for lore and legends, and I'm going to be curating this exhibit at Lucca that's going to be in this like beautiful church. And it'll be an amazing, I think, tribute to the 50th anniversary of D&D that's different from the ones that we're doing at, say, Gen Con, because it's just going to be so focused on the artists themselves and the story of D&D as you can get through the art.
That exhibit sounds really great. Yep. Go ahead, Paul.
Art and Arcana is a big favorite around here. I think that's like the first time that we saw, or certainly that I saw, some of that artwork without all the trade dress on it, right? And that's like being able to like frame and hang some of the prints that are in that thing is amazing. Also, the first time I think that Dan and I became aware of the Tomb of Rahotep. I don't think I had any idea of the existence or the history of that module, and I was really, really pleased to find that inside that book.
Yeah, it's really cool. And just being able to see like the original Spear of Annihilation and things like that. And I mean, Alan Lucian, who designed Rahotep, I mean, he has a credit in the Greyhawk supplement. He's proposed some monsters, some magic items that Gary incorporated into that, and Rahotep just lets you see that close up. How all these, just how crowdsourced it all was, and that's a recurring theme, I think, to all the history stuff that I work on. Is that that the authors of original D&D, created the work, but it's really the fans who created the phenomenon, and whose incremental contributions in innumerable dimensions led to D&D taking the shape that it did and becoming the thing that changed like all of our lives.
That's well put. Paul and I have run Tomb of Rahotep at a couple conventions now, and ran it online once for the WebDM people as players, actually. And so that actually has been a real nice injection to our gaming, and it wouldn't, obviously we wouldn't have that available if you hadn't added it into Art and Arcana.
Yeah, we did a whole show, I think, reviewing it and comparing it to Tomb of Horrors, and I think it ended on with the potentially controversial opinion that it's actually the superior of the two. Sorry, Gary.
Yeah.
Certainly thank Alan Lucian and also thank Alan Groh, who connected me with Alan Lucian on that for helping make the entire thing possible.
Groh has been so, special to like D&D history stuff and kind of keeping the flame for a number of years when it maybe wasn't as popular or in mode to do. So yeah, we're really glad that Alan Groh is active and available to people like you. That's great. Let me ask a couple things. So with the additional research and scholarship that you've done in the past couple of years for things like the making of original D&D or 50 years of Dungeons and Dragons or the revision of Playing at the World. So at this point, can you answer the question of like who was more responsible for D&D, Gygax or Arneson? I mean, what's the answer to that?
I mean, this is like the most this question is the most fraught question, right, about the history of D&D. And to me, I mean, I frankly view it as kind of an attractive nuisance at this point. There are things that we can say about this very right, and then there's a lot of judgment that really is never going to resolve one way or another. Like, one of the virtues of having, the work I did in Game Wizards on the court cases and things like that, right? Like, under oath, like, with the spotlight in his face, when Dave Arneson was asked, did you write the text of this book? Like, is there a single sentence of text in the Three Little Brown Books that you wrote? He's like, verbatim? They're like, yeah, verbatim, like actual text you wrote. And he was like, no. So, I mean, there are parts of that, right, that I think we can nail down. I do think Gary Gygax held the pen and was responsible for synthesizing the material that appeared in the Three Little Brown Books, and that Arneson has gone on record repeatedly on numerous particulars that we can point to about points of disagreement, right, where he would have done things differently and that he was like mad about forever. That said, I think Gygax was very candid from the start that the idea of dungeon adventuring, the idea of measured experience points resulting in levels and people going up in power and things like that, of characterization, are all things that were derived from the black market. We can point in this, actually my piece for the 50 years of D&D anthology you were just referring to, which is just came out from MIT Press this year. It's called Exploration and Experience, the Game Changers, and is entirely about this question of how dungeon exploration and experience systems evolved in Blackmoor. And where are the points where we can see precedents and precursors for those that are clear, and where this is just like straight up innovation, where, I've turned the world upside down for like going on 20 years now to try to find like what really were the precedents, for example, for dungeon exploration. There aren't many, right? I mean, this is something that seems to have been a novel original idea of Arneson's, that, you would conduct this verbal dialogue where you would receive instructions about the environment and would navigate with a conversation with the referee through a secret environment. Man, I would love, and who knows, when I say this is a young science, somebody may do better than me on this someday and like find something that like is a dead ringer for that surely Arneson knew. But I sure haven't found it in like almost 20 years of looking for it. So, this is a long way of answering the question, but there are parts of this we knew Gygax did. There are parts of this that we know Arneson did. And we know Gygax was never confused about the fact that he was simply taking that material from Arneson and integrating it into the project that he made. Which one of those is more important? That's a value judgment, right? Is coming up with the original idea for this more important than being able to articulate it and commercialize it in a form that is going to lead to the hobby we have today? I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. Like, I think you can make an argument either way. I don't have a strong intuition, which is more important.
That's a fascinating, coherent response, and it's something I think about a lot. It seems like a lot of major institutions, companies that I've been at, art projects, musical groups tend to have a core of two people, and it seems common that sometimes there's one idea guy and there's one executor guy. Person, and it seems like a lot of these foundational organizations tend to have two people in that same kind of relationship, and it's kind of an eternal debate about whether it seems like both are necessary.
Both are necessary, and this has been the position I've articulated from the start, that I think they are co-creators in like the most important sense, that they would never have been able to realize this project without the distinct contributions that they brought to it. And both of those contributions were necessary. And so I'm happy to just leave it at that. And, but I think there is a limitless, unfortunately, appetite to take a maximalist position for either one or the other of these guys. And, it's my understanding, actually, there are ongoing disputes about like who wrote "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," right? Like there are partisans of each side of this that have this like vicious debate over, and like it seems like anything there is going to be anything that's important enough to warrant like the attention of posterity. People are going to find something like this because it, because you can keep writing about it, you can keep proposing one or the other, you can it fuels itself, creates this like industry of controversy. When there's a controversy like that, it's easy to see how to contribute by just kind of taking a side and writing about it. And I try my best to just kind of say what happened. And I mean, one of the virtues of doing a book like Making of, which really is just facsimiles of the documents, is it's not my problem. Here's the documents. Like, go nuts. You figure out what you want to make them.
I've seen when I've seen conversations online in the past where people try to draw you into these kinds of debates. I feel like it's been really important that you have done the groundwork in advance to emphasize first person resources, first person documentation, and not be reiterating arguments that people verbalized after the fact. And I personally have always, the first time I read anything of yours, I highly respected the fact that you were putting the groundwork in to do the investigation of the earliest possible resource you could find. And that's really changed the conversations about a lot of those things, I think, for the better.
And I mean, at the end of the day, it's really the objective too of my work. You know, a lot of people in academia, you know, when Playing at the World came out, were kind of puzzled by it. I mean, in that it's not something that an academic historian would write, right? I mean, it's so oblivious to like social or cultural or political themes that would be like obligatory in an academic history, and would kind of ask me like, what is this for? Like, why would you make something like this? And, you know, really my answer to that is the only objective of a work like Playing at the World is to try to provide enough context, and that's a fraught word in academic history too, but we'll leave that aside for the moment, like provide enough context around the birth of D&D to make it, to demonstrate that it is accessible to and worthy of scholarly attention, which previously I think it really wasn't. And you know, the degree to which I think I will have succeeded in moving this ball forward when I'm done, and you know, I'm probably pretty close to done, and I'm not going to write, you know, like a ton more about original D&D at this point. You know, when all said, I hope that's what I've actually accomplished with this work, right? Is making it clear what the archival resources are, laying them out perspicaciously enough that they can be parsed and we can kind of understand why they're important. And I would be perfectly content to have that be how my contribution to this is remembered.
That seems very wise. That seems very wise to me. Yeah. Okay, so I've got you here. Let me dig into the weeds a little bit. Let me dig into the numerical weeds a little bit. One of the things that has been on my mind lately is that when we look at these early character sheets in Arneson's Blackmoor campaign, like for example, the Wizard Gaylord and anything like that, the abilities are a list of like weapon skills, and they tend to be like 20, 30 of, you know, list frequently, basically duplicating the weapons that are in chainmail frequently, and then maybe adding some other stuff initially. And you know, higher numbers are better, and it looks like it's either produced by 2 6-sided dice or maybe 3 6-sided dice. And as far as I think the instinct is that the success initially, the mechanic in those games was to roll maybe 3 6-sided dice and try to roll under your weapon skill or something like that, I think is our understanding. And when Gygax first expresses the basic 2-hit principle for Dungeons and Dragons of a normal man against plate mail should have 2 chances in 20 to hit, and then takes that goal and then converts it to a roll high system. Do you have a sense of like why they changed it from initially roll low to roll high? Why was that done?
I mean, that change, I recall, came between the unattributed rules in Domesday Book number 7 that were, you know, based on ultimately Phil Barker's 1966 medieval combat rules. And there are a couple of different intermediaries that seemed to have passed through before it got to the version that Gygax had. And somebody had sent it to him, right? And he couldn't remember who it was or who had written the rules, so he published it anonymously in Domesday Book number 7. That had a roll under. And then when they flipped this over into chainmail, it had a roll over for those. When you say why, I mean, my best intuition is because the way that the mass combat system worked that they'd adapted from Perrin was a rollover. In other words, you wanted to roll high to hit. And so there was just a general trend towards roll high to hit in these things. I mean, you know, so as far as I can tell, all of that was 2d6 based initially in chainmail, and indeed in the Blackmoor version as well. I mean, the things that are 3d6 based in the personality traits on the Wizard Gaylord sheet, those are only the attributes that actually were in Gaiden D&D, which required you to roll 3d6. So they were like re-rolled or rescaled anyway, to be appropriate to what appeared in Gaiden. There are a number of textual reasons we think that, one of which is that, for example, cunning was added in Gaiden, and cunning is added in pen at the end of the Wizard Key Laird sheet, and the same pen that was used to correct the earlier things from 2d6 to 3d6 rolls for those values. Seems like a pretty solid argument, or solid inference at least. But I mean, when you get into this why roll over or why roll under, I remember when I was first showing bits of Gaiden D&D online, I did a blog post back when I was writing blog posts that was about, why armor class was reversed. And, the Gaiden draft makes it very clear that the reason armor class worked the way it did is because you were supposed to take 20 and subtract armor class from it, and that's what you needed to roll higher than on a d20 in order to hit it. And I thought that was a very simple and plausible explanation for why that would have worked, but I can certainly remember people reacting to it by saying, but yeah, that doesn't really explain it, because it could have worked the other way. Like you could have, start with, if you wanted to roll under, then you would just reverse this, and so why'd they do it this way as opposed to that way? These kinds of decisions are just totally arbitrary. And I mean, the systems changed so much during their playtesting phase, or just during campaigns where they would experiment with things and use this for a bit and then switch to something else. And being able to do system history down to the level to be able to chart why people did things like that, I think is at least beyond my abilities. Maybe some future historian will have better insight than me.
That feels about right. I'm not surprised by that. Yeah. If only.
This has been bugging Dan for quite some time.
why do you want for something that's so arbitrary? I mean, it's asking, why it is that on the first print box of D&D, the wood grain, goes vertically instead, or horizontally instead of vertically. They ordered boxes, and those were the boxes they got. And yeah, by the time they ordered second edition boxes, that box manufacturer, I don't know, due to some difference in their process, now had wood grains that went in a different direction. Sure, you can, but I'm sure they're just a set of historical contingencies that determine things like that.
I'll write a blog post. I'm gonna avoid getting it right. I'll write a blog post. But if you'd made it roll under, you wouldn't have needed the subtraction. There wouldn't have been any math at all for that. There's an additional math operation that's required to do the conversion when, if Gygax's instinct was you should have 2 chances in 20, just use the 2 as the score instead of the subtraction to turn it on its head. Okay, so I think you did like
roll high. You did roll high, and I'm not sure why.
Right.
But I think it's because of our general sense that big things are better than small things. And I think he just found roll high being success was more intuitive.
Yep. And that's what most people say when I bring that up. So it's hard to fight against. It's hard to fight against. It's a strong argument. Yeah, totally. So let me ask another thing that probably the answer is no, but I'm gonna ask this every single time that you show up, and I'm gonna ask this every single time that Luke shows up or anybody else. I'm permanently astonished that we don't have any recordings, either video or audio, of either Gary or Dave running any games. Have you encountered that? Have you unearthed something like that in the last couple of years, or is that still a big blank for us?
I want to say that there is a video of Arneson running a game very late in his life, in the final years of his life. I'm not sure that it's public, but I do think there is one, and it's not very good. But I think it's from Con of the North or something.
Qualities.
Yes, yeah, very much, the 2009 equivalent of a camera phone recording, right? So I mean, not awesome, but something like that exists, I think. But for Gary, no, not as far as I know. Apart from the few moments, on Tom Snyder, where he runs a few lines with Tom,
sure,
right?
Sure.
But actual play also wasn't something that, at that time, I think people really recognized the need to document. And now that's very different.
Surprising.
Of course, everything.
There is an individual, and they were like an editor at some site some number of years ago that I really tried to get in touch with, and they wrote a blog article saying that, like, again, late in Gary's life, he'd just drop by his house, basically asked to play D&D, and Gary said, "Yep," and queued up on the patio table, and supposedly he and a friend had played D&D basically for an afternoon with Gary and had a tape recorder there and taped the whole thing. But I haven't seen that in public, and I haven't been able to get in touch with that individual. But it bothers me that suppose someone's got an audio tape out there of hours of Gary running a session that we haven't been able to hear. So if anybody surfaced anything like that, I feel like it would be like a real gem.
I mean, definitely, yes. We now treasure actual play in a way that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we really didn't. But this is to my point. Things like this are going to come out. Things are going to come to light, right?
In all the research you've been doing, and as a researcher and as a collector, is there a similar or dissimilar thing out there that you're aware of? Some piece of original first source material that you've heard of and are seeking but just haven't been able to nail down?
Sure. Actually, I think in one of the asides in the new version of Playing at the World, I have a line to the effect that, there are some few things I'm aware of that, like, I'd love to be able to see, and I hesitate to breathe their names lest they become harder for me to find rather than easier. So let's face it, like, the connecting community is very, very aggressive these days. There's a lot of deep-pocketed people that are competing for this material, and the things you still can get for reasonable prices are typically things people don't know they want yet.
Interesting. Well, there's your problem, Dan. You got to stop talking about wanting this video and audio. Just pushing it ever further out of your reach.
There's power in names, and I really have to be careful about saying the true name of these things that I want to see.
We're just about out of time here, and
I just got to ask, when is the new Playing at the World going to be out for us?
So the first volume, it's now split into 2 convenient volumes. I don't know how convenient it is. We're going to try this and see if it works. Comes out next month, actually, before Gen Con. So I think it's probably like a July 28th or something release date. And the second volume, I think, will come out spring of 2025. And, the second volume will be far larger. The first volume, with my snazzy new Air Lotus art on the cover, he's actually doing the cover of both volumes. It's not that thick. I mean, here's a making of. It's not that thick. But yeah, so that comes out then, and then if all goes well, and we're kind of in the final stages of getting the proofs and everything locked down, we will see the second volume of Playing at the World out next year.
Fantastic. Paul, thanks for letting me get that question in.
Yeah. John, anything you wanted to get in before we wrap up the show?
I think we've covered enough, man. Jeez, like I said, I really did kind of overcommit in terms of things that are all converging this year, but it is the 50th anniversary, and we just have to do this stuff this year. And so it has been such a privilege to be able to be involved and to help make some of this stuff happen.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
Viewers, check out those links for all the works we've been talking about, and where you can find them are here in the YouTube video description. If you want to find any of John's work, there's you can get a lot of his books on MIT Press. The making of original Dungeons and Dragons, I think, is on D&D Beyond. We have links to both of those in the description, so check it out.
Absolutely. And remember that you can like, follow, and subscribe to us, the Wandering DMs. We are on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and GitHub. We have the handle Wandering DMs on all those sites. So please look for us there and memorialize that like button.
If you prefer to listen to our show in audio-only podcast format, you can do so. Those podcasts are available at our website at wanderingdms.com, also through various third-party carriers such as iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher. If you're listening to this show right now on one of those sites, please take a moment, if possible, to rate and review our show. That helps other users of that site find us, and we really appreciate it.
We really do. And of course, huge thanks to our patrons who support the show here. And just like Paul said at the top of the hour, if you'd like to join them, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms and you'll see our different tiers. Even our $1 tier gets you access to our Discord server where the conversation continues 24/7 all week long. And we'll be there in about 10 minutes for our live video after chat with our patrons, including Jon Peterson. And I have more questions that I couldn't fit in the hour, and I'm sure that you do too. So please, we'd love to see our patrons there every week, especially this week, and we'll get to continue the conversation for a little bit with Jon today. Jon, thank you so much for hanging out for the live after chat hour.
Yeah, sure. No, it'll be fun. And thanks so much for inviting me. It was great to be here again, and I'd love to come back again sometime and chat some more.
You're one of our definitely top guests, and we really appreciate the time in your busy schedule to spend with us all the time. I'm off on Thursday from the normal Old Time Minis show. We'll be back a week after that. But don't forget, we are live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So please join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then. Bye, everyone.